So, the last time we talked, we were taking a look at the after results of the English Civil War. That being, of course, that the monarchy in England was destroyed, the Puritans had taken over, led by Oliver Cromwell, King Charles I had been executed, and King Charles II had been whisked away to France to be raised, and we talked a little bit about the theater that he was being raised on, particularly the theater of Moliere. And again, while not all the playwrights of that era in that place were writing in the same style as Moliere, it was very similar. Those farces and whatnot were the thing to do in France at that time. So what we're going to talk about briefly today is what we call the Restoration. And as we all know, restoration means to restore something. And in this case, we are restoring the monarchy in England. The Puritan rule lasted till about 1660, when it finally collapsed. The monarchy was reestablished, and King Charles II returned and retook the throne. He brought with him a great resurgence in art, in literature, in music, and in theater, and in fashion. All of it heavily influenced by what was going on in France. You can understand why this is. This is where he was raised. This is where he had been educated. This is where he had been entertained, especially during those formative teenage and early 20s years. We all know in our culture how big a role nostalgia plays in informing our entertainment. Well, it was the same here. The king liked the way things were done in France, and so England essentially became kind of France light. The fashions were very much the same, the art was very much the same, the music was very much the same, because that's what the king liked. And what we are going to see when we take a look at the Restoration is that that little phrase is kind of the driving force of it, more so than at any other time artistically throughout history, because the king liked it. That means you like it. And a lot of things that came about during this time period came about because that's what the king liked, and nobody wanted to be the person to say, "Oh, your majesty is wrong." So one of the benefits of the restorations is that the theaters are reopened and plays are allowed to resume. However, they have taken on, again, a distinctly French feel, meaning that the plays are more farcical. We're looking at what we call comedies of humor, kind of taking the example from Ben Jonson. You either have farces, comedies of humor, which are comedies of intrigue, and they feature a lot of daring exploits and big romantic gestures and very, very complicated plots. I'm going to touch on that here in a second. But probably the most famous form of theater to come out of this time is what we would call comedy of manners. So a comedy of manners was influenced very, very heavily by the works of Moliere. Focuses on fashions, the foibles of the upper class, gossip, adultery, sexual escapades. These are the things I like to call monocle poppers. The things wherein the characters on stage get so shocked by things that are not done in society. Pa, 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 pa. The orthodox of this is most un. These comedies poked fun at the social conventions and the norms of the time and satirized the preoccupation of the upper class with reputation. Just like Moliere did, talking about how the upper class was so obsessed with how they were perceived and how they were seen that they would go to just about any lengths to improve their standing. And most of the upper class characters in these plays were incredibly disreputable. Following in the footsteps again of Moliere plays such as Tartuffe, the language was incredibly witty, a lot of repartee, and a lot of sexual references. Again, this is something that was taken very, very heavily from the influence of Moliere. So the comedy of manners kind of became the go-to form of comedy during the Restoration. These would, of course, prove to be the influence for playwrights like Oscar Wilde a century or two down the road. We are not going to take a lot of time and discuss different Restoration playwrights. We're not going to talk a lot about Restoration-style plays, for the simple fact that Restoration comedy is incredibly complex and incredibly difficult to get a handle on in terms of what is going on, what is being said, what the storyline is. A second ago, I mentioned how these plays had big characters, big gestures, and incredibly complicated plots. Well, it seemed everything got more complicated when the Restoration rolled around, including the language. If you think that Shakespeare is difficult to translate and difficult to understand, a Restoration comedy is about 1,000 times more so. I have personally watched 2 Restoration plays that have been produced, and in both instances, I came out of the theater literally dumbfounded. Now, I want to impress upon you the fact that I have dedicated my entire life to the study of theater, the study of putting it on, and the history. I hold 2 degrees in theater. I'm an award-winning actor, director, and playwright. I do not bring up my resume at this point to impress. I bring it up as a frame of reference to say that I am not a novice when it comes to things theatrical. But in both instances of watching a Restoration comedy, I came out of that theater and had absolutely no idea what had just happened. I was able to follow it for about the first 10 minutes, and then I tripped, and I was completely lost for the entire rest of the production. So, there are some wonderful Restoration plays out there, such as The Way of the World, but for the purposes of our discussion, we are not going to bother too much with the plays of the Restoration. I want you to be aware of things like the Comedy of Manners, because it's a direct takeoff from what we were talking about with Moliere, and will be a direct influence to playwrights who are yet to come. So if we're not going to stop off in the Restoration to talk about playwrights, then what are we going to talk about? Well, there is one person from the Restoration era that I feel we need to talk about because we have been awaiting their coming for quite some time. And that person is this young lady, Eleanor Nell Gwynn. We take this time to examine the career and life of Miss Eleanor Nell Gwynn because, quite simply, she is often credited as being the first female actor. Yes, after centuries and centuries of theatrical history, we are finally at the point where women are allowed to be on stage playing women. Now, it should be noted that by the time the English Restoration had rolled around, women had started to appear on the stage sporadically all throughout England. It was not the norm, but it was becoming something of an oddity, something that you could put on a poster and get people to come see. Imagine a point in history where a selling point for a piece of work is not come see the latest special effect or come see the latest sequel to a long-running series, but come see an actual woman playing a female role. These were things that certain playhouses were doing in order to attract audiences back to them. This can also be attributed to the fact that in France, women were allowed to appear on stage. And again, since the king was a big fan of everything French, things like that were starting to find their way into the English theatrical tradition. So why then do we credit Nell as being the first female actor when we know that there were scattered female performances all throughout England? Well, because even if she wasn't the very first, it is because of her that it became legal and it became the norm. And we'll explain how that happened here in just a second. So Nell Gwynn started her career selling oranges at the Theatre Royal in Drury Lane, and she would attract the attention of potential customers by singing songs, doing little dances, putting on funny accents, anything she could do to attract her customers. This natural performance ability caught the attention of a gentleman by the name of Charles Hart. He was the leading actor of the Theatre Royal Company, and he took her under his wing and made her his protege and also his mistress. Nell made her stage debut in December 1664. She specialized in what we would call breeches roles or breeches roles. This is where she would put on men's clothing and deliver humorous monologues or soliloquies to the audience as a man. So ironically, the woman we credit as the first legitimate female actor, her claim to fame was dressing in drag and playing men. So Nell's fame grew. She was apparently a very lively performer, and her fame grew to such a point that she attracted the attention of a certain King Charles II, who took an immediate liking to her. And not far after that, she became his mistress. She lived in the palace. She was friends with the Queen. And one day, as the legend goes, Nell, the mistress, said to her king, "Honey, I want to be a legitimate actor." The king said, "Well then, women can now go on the stage." So from there on, women being on the stage was legal. It became the norm. And Nell would go on to, if not originate, at least make famous as the first female to perform some of Shakespeare's most memorable female roles, such as Juliet and Desdemona from Othello.